This morning, something landed on my desk that made me pause. A ledger of flight manifests and bilateral memoranda that, when laid end to end, reveal a tectonic shift in Canadian statecraft. In 3 days, Prime Minister Mark Carney walks into Evian-les-Bains for the G7 summit. He does not arrive as a supplicant begging for American trade leniency. He arrives having already locked in a strategic partnership with Beijing, a comprehensive economic path with New Delhi, and a formal digital trade architecture with the European Union. These are not aspirational communiques. They are signed, sealed, and operational contracts. This is not the standard operating procedure of a middle power hoping for a seat at the table. This is the calculated construction of a structural exit from the North American trade trap. The official narrative suggests that Canada remains tethered to the US economy by necessity, that 75% of our exports heading south creates an iron cage of dependency. But the sequence of events over the last 15 months reveals a Prime Minister who has spent his tenure actively dismantling that cage. When Carney touched down in Beijing in January 2026, he bypassed the diplomatic malaise that had paralysed the relationship since 2017. He emerged with a commitment to boost exports by 50% by 2030, framing the deal around the precise commodities the new American administration had labelled as leverage points. Energy and clean technology, this move was surgical. While the White House was broadcasting threats of total tariff isolation for any country failing to align with protectionist mandates, Carney stood in the Great Hall of the People and identified the Chinese market as more predictable than the American one. That is the statement of a central banker who has crunched the volatility indices and decided that political rhetoric in Washington has become a greater systemic risk than Chinese regulatory bureaucracy. The timeline of this pivot is aggressive and deliberate. 2 months after Beijing, Carney was in New Delhi. The Canada-India relationship had been a crater since the 2023 diplomatic rupture. Yet, on March 2nd, he stood beside Narendra Modi to announce a comprehensive economic partnership with a target of $70 billion in bilateral trade by 2030, a 7-fold increase from the previous baseline. The centrepiece was a $2.6 billion uranium contract, effectively plugging Canadian high-grade nuclear fuel into the Indian power grid for the next 9 years. This is not diplomacy, it is industrial-grade tethering. When two nations commit to a decade-long supply chain for essential energy, they move beyond political squabbles into the realm of irreversible strategic alignment. Parallel to this, the European front has been quietly solidified. On March 5th, Canada launched formal negotiations for a digital trade agreement, building on the framework of CETA, which has already pushed bilateral trade to €130 billion. By integrating security initiatives like the Security Action for Europe, alongside these commercial pacts, Carney is creating an insurance policy that spans the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. The data confirms this is not merely political posturing. While the Canadian Chamber of Commerce notes that the transition is still concentrated in specific nodes, with Calgary and Ottawa-Gatineau seeing non-US exports surge by over 60%, the trajectory is undeniable. In March 2026 alone, non-US merchandise exports spiked by 24.8%. We are witnessing the most significant structural reorientation of Canadian commerce in the post-WWI era. The architecture is now complete. The USMCA review is 19 days away, and the American negotiating team remains wedded to the assumption that Canada has nowhere else to go. They believe leverage is defined by the volume of trade flowing across the 49th parallel. But Carney has introduced a new variable, optionality. By securing supply lines and market access in 3 major global blocks simultaneously, he has fundamentally altered the math of the upcoming G7 discussions. The question is no longer whether Canada can endure a trade war with its neighbour. The question is whether the United States is prepared to deal with a Canada that has finally stopped treating its own sovereignty as a byproduct of American executive mood swings. As the summit nears, the true test of this strategy begins on the margins. Whether a meeting with the US administration yields a stable trade future or an escalation is now a secondary concern, because for the first time in generations, Canada has a viable alternative to the status quo. However, we must consider the fragility of this pivot. Can a domestic industrial base, still heavily addicted to US consumption, pivot its internal production methods fast enough to satisfy the requirements of these new global partners. The blueprints are signed, but the transition of the Canadian economy from a peripheral appendage of the US market to an independent hub in the global trade network is only just beginning. The architectural shift we've been tracking isn't just a change in diplomatic tone. It is the wholesale replacement of a singular, vulnerable trade pillar with a distributed network of high-value dependencies. If you look at the mechanics of the Carney Doctrine, it becomes clear that he isn't playing defense. He is engaging in industrial statecraft. The cliffhanger isn't just about what happens in the boardroom. It's about the fact that Canada has effectively pre-funded its own autonomy. To understand why this is a structural break from the last 40 years, we have to dissect the deal architecture. It isn't a single grand bargain, but a series of interlocking, sector-specific contracts that insulate the Canadian economy from North American volatility. First, consider the China pivot, formalized in the January 2026 roadmap. The official narrative in Western media focused on the geopolitical friction, but the hidden architecture here was the aggressive dismantling of trade barriers that had choked Canadian producers for years. In March 2026, China didn't just offer rhetoric, they acted. They slashed the combined tariff rate on Canadian canola seed from 85% to 14.9%. This wasn't a favour, it was a calibrated market access move that unlocked $4 billion in annual exports. By resuming beef imports and validating porcine and bovine genetics protocols, the administration essentially diversified the agricultural risk of the Canadian prairies away from the American border and directly into the world's second-largest consumer market. This is the definition of sovereign hedging, ensuring that if the US closes the gate, the lifeblood of the Canadian interior still has a destination. Second, the India-CEPA Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement is the most sophisticated piece of the strategy. This is not about retail goods, it is about energy and nuclear infrastructure. The $2.6 billion Cameco uranium deal, signed on March 2nd, is a masterclass in long-term strategic locking. By binding Canada's high-grade uranium supply to India's Department of Atomic Energy through 2035, Carney has created a 9-year, non-negotiable umbilical cord between the two nations. India is projected to be the single largest contributor to global energy demand growth over the next 2 decades. By securing this supply contract, Canada is not just a commodity exporter, it is a foundational partner in India's industrial rise. The goal here is clear. Move beyond the immigration and education trade model of the last decade and pivot into high-value civil nuclear power and critical mineral supply chains that Washington cannot easily disrupt without fracturing its own security interests. Third, the European Digital Trade Framework, launched in March 2026, completes the triangle. While North American policy is obsessed with the physical movement of heavy goods across the border, Carney is betting the next generation of Canadian growth on the frictionless movement of digital services and intellectual property. The mutual recognition of professional services, specifically for architects and engineers, alongside the pharmaceutical manufacturing protocols, ensures that Canadian firms are integrated into the high-margin European internal market. By joining the EU's Security Action for Europe instrument, Canada is essentially buying a seat at the table of the European industrial military complex. The strategy here is not to replace the United States. That is a fantasy that doesn't survive contact with a calculator. The strategy is to increase the cost of coercion. Every gigawatt of energy, every ton of uranium, and every digital service contract now flowing toward Beijing, New Delhi, or Brussels represents a piece of Canadian GDP that is no longer hostage to the whims of the USMCA review. The most important takeaway is that these agreements are backed by legal frameworks, not just handshakes. The JETC mechanism with China and the ministerial energy dialogue with India are designed to be resilient to political turnover. They are institutionalized. They are permanent. As we approach the July 1st USMCA review, the American trade representatives will walk in assuming they hold all the cards. They will be looking at a map of North America, seeing a captive economy. They will be wrong. They will be negotiating with a government that has already moved its most valuable assets off the table. Canada's diplomatic pivot, Mark Carney's G7 Iran ceasefire push. This video provides critical context on how Prime Minister Carney is leveraging the G7 summit to assert Canadian influence on the global stage, mirroring the same strategic high-stakes diplomacy currently being used to reshape our trade architecture. We have established the foundational reality of this moment. Canada is no longer a passive participant in the North American trade regime, but an active architect of a multipolar commercial existence. By securing the uranium supply chains with India, institutionalizing digital trade with the EU, and recalibrating agricultural access with China, Prime Minister Carney has transitioned the country from a vulnerable, single market dependent to a distributed hub of strategic resources. The big picture here is that the era of total North American economic integration is not just under review. It is being bypassed by a series of deliberate, non-negotiable bilateral contracts. The strategic implications are profound. For decades, the Canada-US relationship was defined by the assumption of a shared destiny. In the pre-Trump era, this was formalized through stable, predictable rules-based trade. Today, that framework has been replaced by the cost of coercion. Washington's reliance on unilateral tariff imposition as a primary lever of statecraft has inadvertently provided the necessary catalyst for Canada to build its own alternatives. By treating dependency as a weapon, the United States has forced its largest trading partner to treat sovereignty as a requirement for survival. The global alliances Canada is currently cultivating, particularly in the G7 context, represent a fundamental shift in our defence and security posture. We are no longer merely a member of a Western bloc. We are becoming a critical node in a resilient supply chain network that spans the Atlantic and Pacific, including the development of advanced quantum and AI infrastructure with France and the broader EU. This is not about leaving the American market. It is about ensuring that if the US market ever reaches a point of total volatility, Canada has the industrial and diplomatic optionality to pivot its output toward partners who are actively seeking stable, long-term resource commitments. Consider the difference in the geopolitical climate. In the previous generation, a diplomatic disagreement with the US would have sent ripples of panic through the Canadian financial sector. Today, the focus is on execution. The $6 billion allocated to the Trade Diversification Corridors Fund is the literal, physical manifestation of this pivot, investing in the rail, port, and dual-use infrastructure required to move Canadian goods into the global market at scale. This is the difference between a country that reacts to trade wars and a country that prepares for them. We are now days away from the USMCA review, an event the American administration likely views as a moment for extraction. They will likely come to the table expecting a supplicant. Instead, they will encounter a partner that has already diversified its most vital industries and locked in supply chains that bypass the American border entirely. The next critical juncture is the July 1st review itself. This is the litmus test for the Carney Doctrine. If the United States attempts to leverage the agreement to extract concessions, we will see whether the optionality built over these past 15 months is sufficient to hold the line. If Canada walks away or refuses to yield on core terms, it will signal the definitive end of the post-Cold War era of North American trade. We are witnessing the birth of a more hardened, pragmatic, and strategically independent Canada. The transition is not complete, but the structural foundations are set. The question for the next few weeks is not how Canada will survive the American negotiation, but how the American administration will reconcile its demands with a neighbour that is no longer asking for permission